My name is Scarlett. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe as steady, reliable, the one who doesn't make noise, the one who has it handled. If you met me casually, at work, at a family gathering, even over coffee, you'd probably underestimate me. People usually do. I don't raise my voice. I don't rush to defend myself. I listen more than I speak. And that silence often gets mistaken for softness, or worse, for permission. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about shouting, humiliating anyone, or winning in some dramatic way. It's about what happens when helping the people you love slowly teaches them the wrong lesson, that your support means they own you. For years, I paid the bills for my family. Not because I had to, because I chose to, because at the time it felt like love expressed through responsibility, stability through action, care without conditions. And for a long time it worked, until it didn't. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of realizing, quietly without explosions, that generosity can be misinterpreted as weakness, that consistency can make you invisible. That's when people get used to your presence as a utility. They stop seeing you as a person. This story unfolds slowly. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden betrayals, no single moment where everything's shattered. Instead, there were small cuts, minor assumptions, casual dismissals that didn't seem worth addressing at the time. I didn't fight back. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't storm out. I observed. And in observing, I learned something most people missed. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from patience, documentation, and knowing exactly when silence stops being endurance and starts being strategy. I'm telling this story honestly. That means I'll include my own mistakes. The moments I stayed quiet too long. The times I rationalized behavior that should have been questioned earlier. I'm not proud of every decision I made, but I am at peace with the one who finally changed everything. If you've ever been the dependable one, if you've ever helped so much that it became expected, if you've ever realized too late that kindness, when unguarded, can quietly erase you, then you'll understand this story. I'm not here to convince you I was right, only to tell you exactly what happened and what it cost. So before we begin, let me ask you something, gently, without judgment. Have you ever wondered whether the people closest to you truly see you, or just the role you play for them? To my family, I was never introduced by my name first. I was introduced by my function. She'll handle it. Ask Scarlett, she knows. She's good with money. I was the solution before I was the person. It didn't start that way, of course. When I was younger, I was just the eldest daughter who did well in school, got a stable job early, and didn't cause problems. I didn't rebel. I didn't ask for much. I didn't struggle loudly. And because of that, everyone assumed I didn't struggle at all. I became the safe place where problems were dropped off. When my parents had financial stress, they didn't ask outright. They sighed near me. When my siblings needed help, it was never framed as dependence. It was temporary, just this once, until things get better. And because I could help, I did. Quietly, efficiently, without keeping score. At family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks, checking on timing, and making sure bills were paid online before dinner ended. No one told me to. It was simply understood. If something went wrong, people looked at me with mild surprise, like a backup generator that failed unexpectedly. No one ever said thank you in a way that lingered. They weren't cruel. That's important to say. They weren't monsters. They didn't insult me or attack me. They simply adjusted, slowly, as people do when something reliable becomes permanent. My help stopped being help and started being infrastructure. If I spoke less, it was because no one really waited for my answer. If I stayed calm, it was because emotions didn't feel useful in rooms where decisions had already been made. I learned early that the fastest way to keep peace was to absorb friction quietly. So that's what I did. At work, I was respected, not celebrated, but trusted. At home, I was depended on, but not consulted. There's a difference. Trust invites participation. Dependence assumes compliance. When financial decisions were discussed, they happened around me, not with me. My role was execution, not opinion. If I disagreed, it was brushed off gently. You're overthinking. It's not that serious. We'll figure it out. Except they never did. I did. I paid utility bills directly. I covered shortfalls without announcements. I made sure the house stayed stable when incomes fluctuated. And because I didn't dramatize it, it never registered as a sacrifice. It registered as normal. That was the role I was assigned: reliable, useful, invisible. And I accepted it, not because I thought I deserved it, but because challenging it felt selfish. I told myself stories to justify staying quiet. They're under stress. This is what family does. I'm lucky I can help. The truth is, I liked being needed. I liked being the calm one. I liked that people leaned on me. What I didn't realize was that leaning over time turns into standing on something. No one checked if I was tired. No one asked if I wanted things to change. No one imagined a scenario where I wouldn't be there. And that's the most dangerous place you can end up in quietly. Being so dependable that your absence becomes unthinkable and your presence becomes unremarkable. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. I felt faded. Like a background wall that holds up the room but never gets noticed unless it cracks. Looking back, the warning signs were subtle. The assumptions, the casual entitlement, the way decisions were announced instead of discussed. At the time, none of it felt worth addressing. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, just a slow shift in how I was perceived. I wasn't Scarlett anymore. I was the system, and systems aren't thanked, they're used. The first time it happened, it was so small that I almost dismissed it myself. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a disagreement. It was a sentence. We were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out the way they always were when something needed to be figured out. Bills, printouts, bank statements, my quiet domain. I had just finished explaining calmly that covering another shortfall would mean delaying one of my own plans. Nothing dramatic, just a fact. My mother nodded absently. My sibling barely looked up from their phone. And then someone said, "Well, you'll manage. You always do." Not can manage, will manage, yachij. The sentence landed differently than the others before it. Not louder, not sharper, just heavier. It carried an assumption I hadn't agreed to. A future decision will be made on my behalf. No one noticed my pause. No one noticed the way my hands stopped moving over the papers. The room continued as if nothing meaningful had been said. But something had shifted. I smiled. I nodded. I adjusted the numbers. That's what I did back then. That's what kept things smooth. I told myself I was being mature, understanding, and flexible. Inside, I told myself something else too. Don't be dramatic. It's just a phrase. But phrases reveal expectations. That was the first time I realized they weren't asking anymore. They were predicting my compliance. And predictions, when repeated often enough, become entitlement. After that day, similar moments started to appear. Quietly, almost politely. Plans were made without checking if they affected me. Financial decisions were announced with the assumption that I would fill in the gaps. Conversations that ended with my contribution implied rather than discussed. Each one was small. Each one is easy to ignore in isolation. And everyone else did ignore them. If I mentioned feeling stretched, it was reframed as stress. If I hinted at wanting boundaries, it was met with reassurance instead of change. "We appreciate you so much," they'd say, while continuing exactly as before. That's the thing about appreciation without adjustment. It's decorative. I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I was still operating under the belief that clarity would come naturally. That if I kept being reasonable, things would self-correct. They didn't. Instead, the language around me changed. Not overtly, subtly. "Since you're already covering that, you don't mind, right? It's easier if you just handle it." Every sentence softened just enough to sound harmless, and I played along because refusing something small feels petty when you've already agreed to something big. That's how boundaries erode, not through force, but through convenience. The first small cut didn't hurt. That's why it mattered. It didn't provoke a reaction. It didn't demand attention. It simply marked the place where my autonomy started being edited out of the narrative. I noticed it. I remember exactly where I was sitting, the light through the window, the tone of the voice that said it. I remember thinking, that didn't feel right. But I didn't act on that thought. I filed it away instead. I started paying closer attention, not in a suspicious way, but in a recording way. I listened to how often my consent was assumed. I noticed how quickly discomfort was smoothed over with humor or gratitude. I noticed how often my silence was interpreted as agreement. No one else changed their behavior, because from their perspective, nothing had changed. I was still there, still paying, still calm. And calm people, especially women, are often mistaken for endlessly okay. That was the first cut. Not painful enough to bleed, not obvious enough to alarm anyone else, but deep enough that I never forgot it. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's the part people rarely talk about. The absence of escalation. Life didn't explode. No one crossed a line so obvious it demanded confrontation. Instead, everything became slightly off. And then that slightly off became normal. The assumptions continued, but now they came wrapped in familiarity. Jokes about me being the bank. Casual comments about how I was the responsible one. Statements that framed my financial support as a natural extension of who I was, not a choice I was making. At first, I corrected them in my head. They don't mean it like that. They're just stressed. This is temporary. Temporary is a powerful word. It gives you permission to endure almost anything. When someone forgot to ask before committing my money to a plan, I told myself it wasn't malicious. When decisions were finalized before I entered the room, I told myself it was efficiency. When my concerns were minimized with a smile, I told myself they trusted my resilience. I became very good at reinterpreting disrespect as misunderstanding. And because I did it so quietly, so convincingly, no one had to question themselves. My rationalizations became their absolution. There were moments, small, sharp moments, when I almost spoke up. When I felt the words rise to my throat, I didn't agree to this. That doesn't work for me. You should have asked. But each time I imagined the response, the confusion, the offense, the way the room would tilt toward me was the problem. So I swallowed it. I didn't want to be seen as difficult, or ungrateful, or dramatic. I had spent years cultivating the image of being stable, and I was afraid that asserting myself would fracture that identity. What I didn't realize was that it already had. They stopped checking my availability. They stopped noticing my exhaustion. They stopped hearing my hesitation. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers repeatedly until you stop recognizing your own voice. I normalized it by telling myself that love meant flexibility, that family meant sacrifice, that my discomfort was the price of stability. And to be fair, part of me believed that. I had been raised to value harmony, to smooth things over, to be the person who absorbs tension so others don't have to. But absorption has a limit. The more I stayed quiet, the more my silence was interpreted as consent. The more I adjusted, the less anyone else felt the need to. I noticed how conversations changed when I wasn't around. Decisions were made faster, riskier. And when consequences appeared, they landed gently in my direction, as if it was only natural. You're better at handling this. You don't get as emotional. You're strong. Strength in this context meant available. I began to feel a strange kind of loneliness, surrounded by people, needed by them, yet unseen. My value was clear. My boundaries were not. Still, I stayed, because leaving felt extreme, and speaking up felt disruptive, and doing nothing felt easier in the moment. So I did what many people do when faced with discomfort they can't yet name. I adapted. I worked more. I planned better. I padded budgets. I anticipated needs before they were expressed. I became even more efficient, hoping that if I could just make everything run smoothly enough, the tension would dissolve. It didn't. It settled. And in settling, it rewrote the rules of how I was treated. By the time I realized that something was wrong, it wasn't a single incident I could point to. It was a pattern, a rhythm, a quiet understanding that my role was no longer optional. I had helped normalize a version of myself that existed for others first. And once a role becomes normalized, stepping out of it feels like betrayal, even when it's your own life. I didn't realize I had been assigned a role until I tried, very gently, to step outside of it. It happened during a conversation that should have been simple. Another expense had come up, not urgent, not dramatic, just another thing that needed to be handled. I said calmly that I couldn't cover it this time. No explanation, no apology, just a statement. The room went quiet. Not angry, quiet, confused quite. They looked at me the way people look at an elevator that doesn't arrive when the button is pressed. Mild disbelief. A moment of recalibration. "Well, what do you mean?" someone asked, as if I had misspoken. I repeated myself, still calm, still neutral. That's when I saw it clearly, not in their words, but in their reactions. The discomfort, the subtle irritation was masked as concern. The way the conversation immediately shifted toward fixing my response instead of adjusting the plan. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't a participant in these decisions. I was a function within them. My role wasn't to choose, it was to support, to stabilize, to make things easier. And roles like that come with unspoken rules. Don't say no. Don't change the system. Don't make others uncomfortable by asserting needs. I had broken a rule without realizing it existed. No one yelled. No one accused me outright. Instead, they offered alternatives that still centered my involvement. Could I delay? Could I partially help? Could I just this once? The assumption wasn't malicious, it was structural. They had built their expectations around my reliability, and systems don't like being disrupted. What struck me most wasn't their reaction. It was mine. I felt a surge of guilt for simply stating a boundary, not because I was wrong, but because I had never trained them to expect anything else. I had taught them who I was, the dependable one, the calm one, the one who doesn't complicate things. And now in their eyes, I was deviating from the script. That realization hurt more than any single comment ever had, because it meant this wasn't about one misunderstanding or one careless sentence. It was about an identity that had been quietly constructed around me with my cooperation. I thought back to how often my opinions had been brushed aside, how often my presence had been assumed rather than invited. How often my help had been framed as natural instead of generous. I wasn't angry, I was clear. Clear that they didn't see me as someone with limits. Clear that my needs had become optional. Clear that the role I played benefited everyone but me. And clarity changes things. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. Every interaction starts to make sense. The way decisions were made, the way my discomfort was minimized, the way gratitude was expressed without change. I wasn't being taken advantage of in the dramatic sense. I was being used efficiently, and efficiency is cold. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make announcements or demands. I went home and sat quietly with the realization. I let it settle. I let myself feel the weight of it without rushing to fix it. Because for the first time, I understood something important. If I wanted to change how I was treated, I couldn't just adjust the behavior. I had to change the role. And changing a role doesn't start with arguments. It starts with awareness. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic line in the sand. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet that no one else would ever remember it. I was alone, sitting at my desk, reviewing my finances the way I had done hundreds of times before. Same notebook, same careful handwriting, same habit of making sure everything and everyone was covered. But this time, something felt different. I wasn't tired, not in the usual way. I wasn't overwhelmed or emotional or resentful. I was calm, clear, almost detached. I remember pausing mid-calculation and realizing something that stopped me cold. If I disappeared tomorrow, not emotionally, not dramatically, but practically, their lives would collapse in ways they had never prepared for. And that wasn't power, that was negligence on their part and on mine for enabling it. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. What would happen if I stopped managing consequences that weren't mine? The answer scared me. Not because it would hurt them, but because it would expose how much of myself I had folded into keeping everything stable. I saw it clearly then. I had mistaken responsibility for obligation. I had treated my ability to help as a lifelong contract. And contracts, when unspoken, are the easiest to abuse. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment. My space. Paid for. Quiet. Orderly. A life I had built carefully, independently. It struck me how separate this world was from the one I was constantly maintaining for others. There was no anger in that realization, just distance. That distance was new. Up until then, every decision I made factored in how it would affect everyone else first. That afternoon, for the first time, I noticed my own absence from the equation. And once you notice that, you can't ignore it. I didn't decide anything that day. Not outwardly. I didn't make calls, send messages, or draw boundaries aloud. What changed was internal and irreversible. I stopped assuming responsibility automatically. That may sound small. It wasn't. It meant that when a problem arose later that week, my first instinct wasn't to solve it. It was to ask myself whether it was actually mine. And when the answer was no, I felt something unfamiliar. Restraint. Restraint isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like stillness. I let conversations finish without offering solutions. I listened without filling the silence. I noticed how quickly others rushed to occupy the space I had always held open for them. No one commented on it. They just adjusted. Slightly uneasy, slightly confused. That's when I understood something crucial. The role only exists as long as you perform it. And I had been performing without realizing there was an audience. That day wasn't about confrontation. It was about withdrawal. Not from people, but from an identity that no longer served me. I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me. I had expected guilt to rush in the moment I stopped overextending. Instead, I felt grounded, present, like I had finally stepped back into my own body. The shift wasn't visible yet, not to them. But to me, everything had changed. Because once you stop reacting out of habit, you start acting with intention. And intention, when quiet, is often mistaken for indifference. They would learn soon enough that it wasn't. After that day, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive. An instinct to keep things smooth, to avoid tension, to carry weight without asking who put it there. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. And choice changes the quality of silence. I still listened, I still showed up. On the surface, nothing looked different. I didn't withdraw affection or become cold. I didn't announce boundaries or issue warnings. I simply stopped filling gaps automatically. When problems came up, I let them sit for a moment longer than usual. When conversations drifted toward expectation, I didn't rush to reassure. When assumptions were made, I noted them instead of correcting them. This wasn't punishment. It was an observation. What surprised me was how quickly my restraint was misread. They thought I was tired or distracted or going through a phase. Someone joked that I was finally relaxing. Another suggested I had less on my plate now. None of them asked why. That told me everything I needed to know. If my silence had been interpreted as strength before, it was now interpreted as absence of resistance. They assumed I was still aligned, just quieter. And that assumption gave me space. In that space, I began paying attention to details I had never bothered to track before. Not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. I listened to how often my name came up in financial conversations as a solution rather than a person. I noticed how plans were made with an invisible asterisk. Scarlett will cover it. I also noticed something else, how fragile their systems were without my immediate input. Delays caused confusion. Questions bounced around the room longer. Decisions stalled, and each time someone would glance in my direction, waiting for me to step in. I didn't, not out of spite, out of discipline. Silence, when used intentionally, becomes a mirror. It reflects back what others are relying on you to provide. And what it reflected was startling. They didn't have backups, they didn't have plans, they had me. I started documenting, not in a dramatic way, not for leverage yet, but for understanding. I wrote down who asked for what, how often, and in what tone. I noted when consent was assumed versus requested. I tracked how often just this once happened. Patterns emerged quickly. The more I stayed quiet, the more others spoke. And in their speaking, they revealed expectations they had never voiced aloud. They spoke freely around me, assuming my agreement was a given. That's the danger of being underestimated. People stop guarding their assumptions. They also stop imagining consequences. I didn't correct them, not yet. Because silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was positioning. I was learning where the weight actually rested, who depended on what. What would happen if I removed myself? Not emotionally, but structurally. And the more I learned, the calmer I became. Calm is often mistaken for compliance, especially in women, especially in families. They mistook my quiet for exhaustion. They thought I was still absorbing, still managing internally. They didn't realize I had stopped carrying what wasn't mine. This phase lasted longer than they noticed. Weeks, months. Long enough for habits to deepen, long enough for reliance to harden. I didn't rush. There was no urgency. When you've spent years reacting, patience feels like power. And for the first time, I understood that power doesn't announce itself. It waits until it's undeniable. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they assumed nothing had changed. Because on the surface, I was still me. Still calm, still present, still available enough to avoid suspicion. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't disappear. I didn't become distant in a way that would alarm them. I simply stopped compensating. And in that absence of compensation, the truth became visible. I began to see how often urgency was manufactured, how frequently were framed as immediate when they were merely inconvenient, how emotional pressure was used unconsciously most of the time to speed me into agreement. When you step back, patterns become data. So I treated them that way. I documented dates, amounts, requests, who initiated them, and how. I noted which conversations included me as a decision maker and which only included me as a solution. I kept track of how often family was used as justification and how rarely responsibility was shared equally. This wasn't bitterness, it was inventory. I also started learning things I had never needed to before, because I had always been the buffer. Legal language, financial boundaries, tenant rights, shared responsibility frameworks. Not because I planned to weaponize them, but because I wanted to understand exactly where I stood. Knowledge changes posture. The more I learned, the less emotional everything felt. What once felt personal began to look procedural. Systems, dependencies, imbalances. They were living inside a structure that relied heavily on my silence. And structures like that don't collapse loudly. They fail quietly, piece by piece. I noticed how often people spoke for me. Scarlett's fine with it. She won't mind. She understands. Each statement was made confidently, without checking. And each time I let it pass. Because correction would have protected them. Silence allowed exposure. They also never noticed how my generosity changed shape. I didn't stop helping entirely. I helped differently, less predictably, more selectively. Enough to maintain normalcy, not enough to reinforce entitlement. That inconsistency unsettled them, though they couldn't articulate why. "What's your schedule like these days?" someone asked once, casually. I smiled. "Busy?" It wasn't a lie. I was busy reclaiming my life. Behind the scenes, I separated accounts, clarified ownership, organized documents. I made sure everything I was responsible for was clearly defined, and everything I wasn't was no longer ambiguous. Ambiguity is where people hide expectations. Clarity removes hiding places. What struck me most during this time was how little anyone asked about me. no curiosity about my plans, no concern about my long-term goals. Their attention remained fixed on continuity, on whether the system would keep running. That told me something painful but useful. They weren't invested in my presence. They were invested in my function. And once you accept that, you stop seeking validation from the wrong place. I also noticed how comfortable they were speaking around me, not to me. They discussed future plans that involved my resources as if they were abstract, hypothetical, already secured. They didn't realize they were narrating their own dependence out loud. Every assumption was a thread. I followed them all. By the time they sensed something was off, it was too late to trace it back to a moment. Nothing had happened to them yet. There was no conflict to point to, no argument to blame. I was still polite, still composed, still helping, just not in ways that erased me. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing their approval. That shift is invisible from the outside, but inside it changes how you move, how you listen. How do you decide? I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't waiting to teach anyone a lesson. I was preparing to step out of a role that no longer fit. And I was doing it carefully, because careful exits don't give people time to rewrite the story. They didn't notice the preparation. They only noticed the consequences later. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from paperwork. I was sitting alone late one evening, surrounded by documents I had organized so many times before that I could almost recite them from memory. Bank statements, payment histories, agreements that were never formalized because we're family. That phrase echoed differently now. As I laid everything out, chronologically, methodically, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. I wasn't just helping, I was carrying risk, carrying responsibility, carrying consequences that legally, financially, and ethically were never meant to be mine alone. And the most startling part? They had very little standing without me. I don't mean that cruelly, I mean it structurally. Many of the arrangements depended on my consistency but offered me no protection. Payments made without shared accountability. Decisions made without documentation. Expectations enforced socially, not contractually. For years, I had assumed that my position was weaker because I was the one giving more. That assumption was wrong. Giving, when tracked, becomes leverage. Not in a manipulative sense, but in a factual one. I realized that if I stepped back cleanly and lawfully, the entire structure would have to rebalance. Not because I wanted it to fail, but because it had been built unevenly. This wasn't empowering in the way people imagine empowerment. There was no rush, no sense of triumph, just a quiet, sobering clarity. I saw how exposed I had been and how little they had noticed. The reveal wasn't about what I could take away. It was about what I could finally stop providing without violating my own values. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I wanted to stop being quietly harmed. I spent days thinking through the implications. Not emotionally, logistically. What would change? Who would be affected? What timelines were reasonable? What responsibilities were genuinely mine and which had been assumed over time? I also confronted something uncomfortable. They would feel blindsided. Not because I had been deceptive, but because they had never listened closely enough to notice my gradual withdrawal. That isn't betrayal. That's a consequence. I prepared myself for their confusion, their panic, and their attempts to negotiate once they realized what was happening. I prepared myself to remain calm, not because I wanted control, but because I didn't want the story to become about emotion instead of reality. The leverage I discovered wasn't power over them. It was the power to leave the role. That distinction matters. I could exit without drama, without accusations, without escalation. I could do it cleanly, legally, ethically. And once I saw that path, I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend I hadn't. There's a moment when knowledge removes innocence. This was mine. I closed the notebook that night and sat in silence for a long time. Not grieving them, but grieving the version of myself who believed that being indispensable was the same as being loved. It isn't. The clarity didn't make me cold. It made me precise. And precision is what allowed the next decision to be final. Once you see a clean exit, you can't unsee it. But seeing a path and walking it are very different things. I spent weeks at the decision point, not wavering but weighing. There were options. I could renegotiate quietly. I could reduce support gradually and hope they adapt. I could have a long emotional conversation and try to reset expectations. Each option had one thing in common: they required them to suddenly see me differently. And that was the risk. Because when people benefit from your role, they rarely want to question it. Even well-intentioned people resist change that costs them comfort. I also knew something else by then. Any solution that depended on their understanding would leave me vulnerable again. So I chose the option that didn't require permission. The irreversible one. Irreversible doesn't mean cruel, it means clear. I decided to remove myself structurally, not emotionally. To change the system rather than argue within it. To stop being the silent backstop and allow responsibility to land where it always should have. This wasn't a decision made in anger. I didn't feel dramatic or righteous. I felt steady, almost relieved. Relief comes when alignment returns. I gave myself time, not to hesitate, but to prepare emotionally for the fallout, because I knew there would be confusion, possibly resentment, maybe even accusations. I also knew I would not defend myself endlessly. I rehearsed calm sentences, simple truths, boundaries that didn't invite debate. I reminded myself that explaining is not the same as justifying. And then I set a timeline. Not rushed, not indefinite, just enough notice to be fair, without giving space for manipulation or guilt. That was the hardest part. Resisting the urge to soften the impact at my own expense. Resisting the familiar pull to make things easier for everyone else. I reminded myself, fairness is not self-erasure. The day I committed internally, nothing changed outwardly. That's the strange thing about irreversible decisions. They're invisible until they aren't. I still showed up, still smiled, still participated. But inside, I was no longer available for negotiation. This wasn't revenge, it was completion. I had finished playing a role that no longer reflected who I was. And once you finish something fully, you don't reopen it to reassure others. The decision didn't make me powerful in the way people imagine power. It made me quiet, grounded, untouchable by guilt. Because guilt only works when you believe you owe something you don't. I didn't owe them my future. I owed myself integrity. And that decision, once made, did not bend. Once the decision settled fully inside me, urgency disappeared. That's something people misunderstand about decisive moments. They imagine adrenaline, momentum, action. But real decisions, irreversible ones, don't rush. They quiet everything else. I didn't feel the need to act fast. I felt the need to act cleanly. So I moved slowly, intentionally, invisibly. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same schedule, same demeanor, same willingness to listen, same calm presence at family gatherings. I didn't pull away emotionally because emotional distance would have raised questions. Instead, I adjusted the structure. Structure is where power actually lives. I began with my finances, not in a dramatic way, not by cutting anything off overnight, but by restoring logic where emotion had long replaced it. I separated what had been blurred over years of convenience and trust. Payments that had once been automatic were returned to manual review. Transfers that used to happen without thought were paused, reconsidered, rerouted. Not eliminated, reassigned. Every change I made had one guiding principle. If I were questioned tomorrow, could I explain this calmly without defending myself? If the answer was yes, it stayed. If it required justification, I waited. That patience protected me. I stopped anticipating problems before they occurred. That alone changed everything. For years, I had quietly absorbed instability by planning around other people's habits. Late payments, optimistic timelines, vague promises of next month. I removed myself from that buffer position. Not loudly, not resentfully, just factually. Bills that had once been padded now reflected reality. Gaps that I used to close invisibly were allowed to remain visible. I didn't create consequences. I stopped hiding them. And what surprised me most was how long it took for anyone to notice. At first, the confusion was minor. Someone would mention that something looked different. Another would assume an error, a delay, a technical issue. No one thought to ask me directly, because they didn't think of me as the variable. That told me how deeply my role had been naturalized. I also changed my language, subtly but consistently. I won't be able to do that. That's something you'll need to arrange. I'm not involved in that anymore. No apologies, no explanations. Explanation invites negotiation. Negotiation invites pressure. I stayed polite, neutral, unmoved. Emotionally, this phase was quieter than I expected. I had prepared myself for guilt, for doubt, for the familiar urge to soften edges. But those urges didn't come. Instead, I felt something steadier, alignment. For the first time in years, my internal boundaries matched my external behavior. Behind the scenes, I also reviewed everything I had once taken on out of habit: leases, subscriptions, informal agreements that had never been formalized because we trust each other. I clarified ownership. I documented responsibilities. I made sure that what was mine was clearly mine, and what wasn't no longer touched my accounts or my credit. This wasn't defensive, it was corrective. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because I was hiding it, but because announcing it would have shifted the focus to emotion instead of logistics. People react to change differently when it's framed as feeling versus fact. I chose fact. As weeks passed, small disruptions began to ripple outward. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, just friction. Plans took longer. Decisions stalled. Stress appeared in conversations where there used to be ease. Someone would sigh and say things were getting complicated lately. I listened. I noticed how often discomfort was attributed to external factors: timing, bad luck, miscommunication, anything but the truth. The truth was simple. The system was adjusting to the absence of my silent labor. Still, no one confronted me. They assumed I would step in eventually, that this was temporary, that I'd smooth it over like I always had. They were waiting for my instinct to rescue. I no longer had that instinct. What I did have was resolve. There's a difference between being quiet because you're afraid of conflict and being quiet because you've already decided. The first kind of silence is fragile. The second is immovable. I had crossed that line. And the longer I moved this way, methodically, calmly, without announcement, the harder it became for anyone to undo it. Because nothing I was doing was wrong. Nothing could be challenged without exposing the imbalance they had grown comfortable with. By the time frustration started to surface, the foundations had already shifted. There was no single action to point to, no dramatic moment to reverse, just a gradual realization that something essential was no longer being provided. And they couldn't yet name what it was. That was the final protection. Because when people can't name what they've lost, they struggle to demand it back. I wasn't disappearing. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply no longer compensating for what had never been my responsibility. And once that stops, consequences don't need to be enforced. They emerge on their own. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They arrived with discomfort first, as confusion, as irritation that had no clear target. Someone mentioned money feeling tighter lately, in a tone that suggested coincidence. Another complained that things were suddenly harder to coordinate. A third joked, half joking, half anxious, that everything used to run more smoothly. They were right. They just didn't understand why. I watched the shift happen in real time, quietly, from the same seat I had always occupied. I didn't smirk. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was distance, the kind that comes when you've already accepted an outcome. The first real crack appeared when a bill went unpaid. Not catastrophically unpaid, just late enough to cause stress, just visible enough to raise voices. They searched for the problem the way people do when they're used to invisible solutions. They retraced steps. They blamed systems. They questioned each other. No one asked me, and that hurt, briefly. Not because I wanted credit, but because it confirmed what I had already understood. I wasn't seen as a person who helped. I was seen as a mechanism that had malfunctioned. Mechanisms aren't consulted, they're fixed. When someone finally did look at me and ask, "Did something change?" The question wasn't curious, it was unsettled, like someone noticing the floor had shifted slightly beneath their feet. I answered honestly, calmly, yes, that was all. I didn't elaborate, I didn't reassure them, I didn't rush to explain how things could go back to normal. Normal was the problem. The weeks that followed were filled with tension that no one quite named. Conversations grew sharper around the edges. There was more urgency in voices, more quiet frustration, less ease. They felt the absence of my support without understanding its shape. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. You only notice it when it stops. They began to scramble. Plans were revised, responsibilities were redistributed clumsily. Stress leaked into places it had never touched before. And still, they didn't confront me directly. Because confrontation would have required acknowledging that I had been carrying more than my share, and that realization would have forced them to question themselves. It was easier to believe this was temporary, that I'd step in eventually. I didn't. I stayed kind. I stayed present. I didn't withdraw emotionally or become cold. I simply didn't rescue. And without rescue, patterns break. Someone snapped one evening, not at me, but near me. Frustration spilled out sideways. Another person grew quiet and withdrawn. Guilt appeared in strange places, disguised as irritation. They were feeling something they hadn't felt in years. Consequence. Not punishment. Consequence. The difference matters. I didn't cause their stress. I stopped absorbing it. And that distinction kept me steady when they began to look at me differently. Not with entitlement, but with uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, especially when you've mistaken stability for permanence. By the time they realized this wasn't a phase, that I wasn't coming back into the role they had grown accustomed to, something else had shifted too. Their dependence was no longer hidden, it was exposed. And exposure changes the dynamics, whether anyone speaks about it or not. I could feel the moment when they understood, quietly, reluctantly, that things would not return to the way they were. That I was not going to save them from the system they had relied on me to sustain. And in that realization, something fragile broke. Not our relationship, their assumptions. The moment they realized it was too late didn't come with shouting. It came with panic that had nowhere to land. By then, the discomfort had grown into something heavier. Bills were no longer just tight. Plans were no longer just delayed. The absence of my quiet support had begun to affect choices, moods, and relationships between them. They started asking different questions, not what was wrong, but how things had become this unstable so quickly. That's when the conversation shifted, not toward accountability, toward urgency. There were attempts to recreate the old rhythm, suggestions framed as solutions that suspiciously resembled my former role. Comments like, maybe we can just go back to how we were doing it before, spoken as if the system itself had failed, not the dependence on me. I listened. I noticed how no one asked whether I wanted to go back. They were trying to fix the outcome without addressing the cause. That's when regret started to appear, not openly, not cleanly, but sideways. In tone, in hesitation, in half-finished apologies that stopped short of responsibility. Someone said, "We didn't realize how much you were doing." Another said, "You never said it was a problem." Both statements were true in the way incomplete truths always are. I had been doing a lot, and I hadn't made it a problem. Because I had been taught that making it a problem would make me the problem. By the time they tried to talk, really talk, it wasn't about understanding, it was about reversal, about undoing the consequences they were now feeling in their bodies and their lives. And reversal was no longer possible, not because I was being stubborn, but because the system had already changed. Responsibilities had shifted. Structures had adjusted. I had stepped out of the role cleanly and completely. You can't reverse clarity. Panic makes people clumsy. They said things they hadn't said before, admitted things they hadn't planned to admit. Frustration leaked into honesty. "We assumed you'd always handle it. We didn't think you'd actually stop." There it was. Not cruelty, not malice, assumption. And assumptions, once spoken aloud, lose their power. I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of every time I had helped, every boundary I had swallowed. That wasn't necessary anymore. The truth was visible now. They tried to negotiate, not overtly, but emotionally. Guilt surfaced. Fear, appeals to family, to loyalty, to history. Old phrases dusted off and reused. I held steady. Not cold, not angry, just unmoved. Because by then, my decision wasn't something I was enforcing. It was something I had completed. They could feel that. That finality unsettled them more than any argument would have. There's a moment in every imbalance when the people benefiting realize the cost is now theirs to carry. That moment is rarely graceful. This was theirs, and it was too late to fix it, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because returning would have required me to betray myself again. That wasn't an option anymore. The confrontation happened quietly. No one announced it. No one planned it. It emerged the way pressure always does, when avoidance runs out of space. We were sitting together, the same way we had so many times before. Familiar room, familiar chairs, familiar tension hanging just beneath the surface. Someone finally said my name, not sharply, not angrily, carefully, as if volume might decide the outcome. "We need to talk." I nodded. "I know." That alone shifted the room. They were prepared for resistance, for defensiveness, maybe even tears. What they weren't prepared for was calm agreement. The conversation didn't begin with accusations. It began with confusion. "We don't understand what changed. Things used to work. We didn't realize how much depended on you." I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without filling the silence they left behind. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell a long story. I didn't revisit old wounds or list every sacrifice I had made. I didn't need to. "I didn't disappear," I said. "I just stopped carrying what wasn't mine." That was it. No dramatic pauses, no raised voice. The words landed heavily because they were simple. They tried to explain themselves, to contextualize, to smooth it over with intention. "We never meant... We thought you were okay with... You always seemed fine." I nodded again. "I was fine," I said, "until I wasn't." That sentence ended something. They asked if there was a way forward, a compromise, a new arrangement. And here's the part that surprised them most. I didn't say harshly. I didn't say yes either. I said, "The way forward already started. This is it." They sat with that. I could see the moment they realized there would be no emotional bargaining, no negotiation fueled by guilt or urgency. I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't trying to reclaim control. I was simply done performing. The room felt different then. Quieter, more grounded. The kind of quiet that comes when reality finally settles in. Someone asked softly, "So, you're not going to help anymore?" I chose my words carefully. "I'll help as a person," I said, "not as a system." That distinction mattered. There was no argument after that, no shouting, just a shared understanding that something fundamental had changed and couldn't be undone. Confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one that's already made peace with the outcome. After everything settled, I expected to feel lighter. Instead, I felt clear. There's a difference. Lightness can be temporary, an emotional release, a reaction to pressure lifting. Clarity is steadier. It doesn't rush in or fade out. It stays. I didn't cut my family out of my life. That's important. This wasn't about punishment or distance. It was about redefining who I was in relation to them and to myself. I'm no longer the silent backstop. I'm no longer the default solution. I'm no longer introduced by what I provide. And surprisingly, that didn't make me lonely. It made my relationships more honest. Some dynamics changed permanently. Conversations became more measured. Requests were phrased differently, or not made at all. There was an adjustment period where everyone seemed unsure how to interact with me without the old script. That uncertainty didn't bother me, because for the first time, I wasn't negotiating my worth through usefulness. I noticed how my energy shifted once I stopped carrying invisible weight. I slept better. I made plans without mentally calculating how they might need to be rearranged. I stopped bracing for emergencies that weren't mine to manage. I also noticed something else. When I did choose to help, it felt like a gift again, not an obligation. Choice restores dignity. My sense of self changed quietly. I didn't reinvent myself or announce a new identity. I simply allowed myself to exist without justification. At work, nothing changed. That stability reminded me that competence doesn't require self-erasure. Respect doesn't demand silence. At home, the absence of my old role created space for others to grow, to struggle, to adapt. That growth wasn't always comfortable to watch, but it wasn't my responsibility to prevent it. And I didn't feel guilty about that anymore. Guilt thrives in confusion. Clarity starves it. I learned that boundaries don't have to be loud to be effective, that you don't need to prove how much you've given to justify stepping back. That quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about alignment. I didn't win anything. I reclaimed myself, and that was enough. Looking back now, I don't frame the story as something that happened to me. I see it as something I participated in until I didn't. That distinction matters because it removes blame without removing responsibility. It allows growth without bitterness. It turns pain into understanding instead of resentment. I didn't lose my family. I didn't destroy relationships. I didn't need revenge to feel whole again. What I lost was an illusion, the belief that being indispensable is the same as being valued. For a long time, I thought love meant being the one who never lets things fall apart. I thought strength meant absorbing discomfort quietly. I thought if I stayed calm, stayed useful, stayed available, everything would stay intact. But what actually stayed intact was everyone else's comfort, at the cost of my own presence. The truth is, people don't always realize when they've crossed a line, especially when the person affected never draws it. Silence can be generous, but it can also be misleading. And when generosity isn't protected by boundaries, it becomes an open door, one people walk through without noticing the threshold. There was no villain in this story, just assumptions left unchallenged for too long. Just roles that hardened into expectations. Just a system that worked, until the person holding it together stepped aside. Quiet dominance isn't about power over others. It's about power over your own life. It's the moment you stop reacting out of habit and start acting out of alignment. It's choosing clarity over approval, even when that clarity makes others uncomfortable. I didn't announce my exit from the role. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't demand recognition for what I had given. I simply stopped giving what cost me myself. And when I did, everything that depended on that silence had to change. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. If your absence would create chaos, that doesn't mean you're essential. It may mean you're being overused. You don't owe anyone your exhaustion. You don't owe anyone the version of you that disappears to keep things smooth. Being kind doesn't require being invisible. So I'll end where I began, not with accusation, but with a question. Have you ever been so reliable that people forgot to ask whether you were okay? And what would change in your life if you stopped holding everything together quietly? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.